Thank you very much, Anne Marie. And yeah, like she said, I'm glad you're here. Welcome for wherever you're calling from. Um, like she said, my name's Eric Berget. I'm the creative director at Dash and Thompson, and I'm coming to you from my basement in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So greetings to you wherever you're zooming in from. So let's get started. I have three kids, 8, 7, and 4 years old. And that's really where this conversation begins. And so why am I here talking about storytelling? Well, a few months ago, I was tucking in my kids for bed and turning the lights off, shutting off the blinds. And my 4-year-old looks up to me and says 5 words. And it really wasn't a surprise to me because he says the same 5 words pretty much every night at this time. He says, "Tell me a story, Dad." And this kid, genuinely loves stories, and all of my kids love stories. Every kid loves stories. And he says, "Tell me a story when you were a kid." And I wish I could say that every night, I regale my children with stories of my childhood adventures and have these lavish tales. I'm not a great storyteller. I'm not, sometimes I fumble through some old memory and I try to turn it into a story. But there was something about that night that just got me thinking about how innate and like how ingrained this gravitation towards stories is. From childhood, we desire stories. And so I started seeing things and observing things with this lens in mind, a storytelling lens. I even, observed my own drifting attention. If I was sitting in like a sermon or at church in a sermon or something, I would notice my attention drift. And then when the pastor started into a story, it's like my attention just snapped into focus. Like, oh, where's this going? He's starting to talk about when he was a kid. And I just observed that, and I just thought that is interesting. So here we are, thinking about the role of storytelling in learning experience design. As trainers and communicators, we're often handed the task of constructing a contrast between the what is and the what could be, or sometimes the what will be, the current state versus the future state, the old normal and the new normal. So let me start by proposing a description of the current state of learning experience design. Training, it can too often be boring. And maybe the word is uninspiring. It's too often an information dump, a kind of a one-dimensional set of information that lacks enough relevance or something. It's missing something to be engaging and inviting and inspiring. So whether it's sales training, product training, software, process, compliance training, it's difficult. And I mean, of course, we know training is not meant to be entertainment. And so that's the challenge, right? We often have a lot of information that we're trying to communicate. And we have learning objectives, and we have this objective-based approach, which is good. We have this set of objectives, and often we take those objectives bit by bit. The list goes piece by piece. We connect those to this list of information. And then if we have the information that relates to the objectives and we put it in front of faces, then we can check it off of our list. And now you can consider yourself hereby trained. And now, I'm exaggerating. I think we're all probably at different points and places in this journey. Maybe some of you feel like you've been wandering in that exact bullet point wilderness for 40 years. And maybe there's others that feel like you're further along in the journey. Maybe you bear the scars and accolades of successful ERP implementations gone by, and you've learned a thing or two on the way. But either way, I feel like we're all here because we feel like there's something more. You know, there's a better way to train and a better way to communicate. So let's explore this ancient power of story together. So first, let's gather around a shared definition. What is a story? And one time I heard an improv actor describe it this way. He said, a story is a character in pursuit of a goal in the face of a challenge. A story is a character in pursuit of a goal in the face of a challenge or an obstacle. And story has taken a million different forms and had a million different themes or lessons or emotions layered throughout. But the greatest stories, whether it's a book or a movie or your Uncle Larry, they all have richly described characters, and you just ache to see them or are intrigued to see how they're going to overcome these obstacles or these challenges. And they have a clear and compelling goal. And regardless of what the emotion or theme or lesson is, you know, our hearts and minds are drawn into that structure when we hear about a character in pursuit of a goal in the face of a challenge. And so I think what's interesting is that regardless of what that theme or lesson is, it doesn't matter if, you know, here's what's peculiar. It doesn't have to be the noblest of characters or the noblest of goals. It's not like it's proportional to how much you enjoy this story if those are, you know, the highest goals and the highest characters. In fact, it's actually the opposite with characters, isn't it? Where if there's a character, the protagonist, if they're flawless and they really don't have much weakness, we don't really find those stories interesting, right? We're interested if the character has flaws and has weaknesses and has dimension. Then we get curious to see, is that character going to overcome those weaknesses, or how will those interact with the story? And think about goals in a story. I was just thinking about this show I just watched recently called Ted Lasso. It's about an American football coach. He gets hired by a British soccer team. He knows nothing about soccer, but he has relentless enthusiasm. He encourages everybody. He's super positive, and he has this like unwavering hope. And it's a simple story. It's not, you know, it's not a complex plot, but I would describe it as a surprisingly compelling show. And what's interesting is that the goal of this story is not to win the championship, but it's to prevent relegation, which in British soccer is like, if you're the last place team, you get knocked out of the league into a lesser league. And so literally the goal is to not be the worst, which is, it's humorous in that, you know. And so I think with a compelling story, it doesn't matter what the goal is. It just matters, you're just drawn in to see how he interacts with obstacles and challenges to reach that goal. So in this case, there's, you know, obstacles or challenges in a personal sense of, you know, some members on the team are difficult to work with, and, you know, prima donna players, and the owner that hired him to coach the team is trying to, you know, is hoping that they lose the season. And so how does he work around that? And it's a really interesting dynamic. So we're drawn into this. We're drawn into this structure of a character trying to achieve a goal and overcoming challenges along the way. So why is that? Why is information or content more compelling when it's embedded within this structure? Like, what's so magical about this? And to answer that question, let me tell a story. So 16 years ago, it's January, and Bethel University in Roseville, Minnesota. And at Bethel, they have what's called a J term. It's one full course condensed into 1 month in January. And so for some reason, I thought it wise to sign up for a class called Literature of the Oppressed. Literature of the Oppressed. So there I am down in the basement of Bethel in the bookstore, filling my bag with books like slave memoirs, native accounts of conquest and disease, Holocaust accounts, and many more autobiographies like in this genre. So I zip up my bag with 20 pounds of books and like 20,000 years of oppression on my back and head out into the icy tundra of the Bethel campus. At this point, as much as I want to be Mr. Empathy and Mr. Well-Read, I'm thinking perhaps January was not the optimal time to absorb and reflect on mankind's most despicable behavior. And I'm wondering, like, what cruel and depressed professor would dwell in this unceasing darkness? Well, it turns out this professor was quite remarkable. Dan Taylor was his name, Professor Dan Taylor. And he was not cruel or depressed or anything like that. He really carried himself with this soft-spoken, grandfatherly joy. It was a heavy course, no doubt. It was a heavy month, but it was also beautiful. Professor Taylor, he used these heartbreaking first-person stories, not as a means to just catalog mankind's most, atrocious behavior, but he used the literature to demonstrate the power of story itself. And showed like how it's a tool like any other. So returning to the original question, what is so compelling about this structure? Why are we drawn in? And Professor Taylor helped me see that stories help us learn lessons without having to fully suffer ourselves. We become witnesses. So we stand adjacent to the action, close enough to feel the emotion, close enough to learn, but not so close to suffer fully as the story unfolds. Stories help us learn lessons without having to fully suffer ourselves. So I want to highlight the word lessons. What lessons? Is it just a desire? We have this desire for more information? No, I don't think so. I think it's a desire for meaning. I think it has something to do with what makes us unique as humans. We are meaning makers. We are meaning seekers. And our brains do that by seeking patterns. We gaze into the chaos of the world. We squint until we discern some kind of recognizable order. We'll look backward into history and we'll ask, what are the dates and months or dates and moments worth remembering and worth retelling? 1776, 1619. If these numbers stand alone, they're simply facts or dots, patternless bits of information. But values, lessons, and meaning can be told by connecting dots through story. So when we see isolated dots of data, we have this we're compelled to connect those dots and to recognize the patterns. And stories represent the most powerful and meaningful way of doing just that. Stories instill meaning and they stick in our memory. And so then it impacts how we move forward and how we make choices. So we're constantly connecting those dots, writing and rewriting our narratives in a way that helps us make sense out of the chaos. And that's a big part of what it means to be human. We are hardwired to be drawn into these stories, like strings on a guitar. You know, our DNA just resonates with a story well told. So what does this have to do with my training department, you might be saying? Well, okay, the question is, how do we bring this powerful and instructive, like instinctive art form into, you know, into learning, into our workplace, where we can learn and grow as, you know, as we work? How do we bring it into learning experience design? And based on how I've started the conversation, you're probably thinking I'm going to suggest exchanging the conference table for some kind of a campfire. That's not quite going to pass the safety guidelines, I'm afraid. So we'll have to think of something else. So let's focus in on ways to take this storytelling within our training strategy and in our culture. And now, you know, we probably have a wide variety of L&D problems that you're all trying to solve. And, you know, every project's a little bit different, but I think it's best to approach this by asking the question, what can stories accomplish? What can stories accomplish? Then maybe that, hopefully that will give you kind of a vision of where does this fit within the problems I'm trying to solve. So what can stories accomplish? First, stories elicit emotion, and they elicit emotion that can possibly fuel a desire to change or to improve or to make choices in a certain way. So as I walk through these, I'll show some examples of recent projects that we've done that you know, might be an inspiration to for you in your situation. So this is a project we did a few years ago. It was on emergency preparedness content policy. So in this situation, we took policy and we turned it into a story. We had illustrations, and in this case, it's really almost literally like story, where we made it look like a kid's book and had, you know, an actual professional illustrator do the images. It was really simple on actual interaction, where it was mostly just a narrative, and then every once in a while we'd have a basic multiple choice question. What would you do in this situation if all of the telephone lines went out? And so, and I should say the context of this story is Mike's very bad day. It's that the premise of what's the children's book of Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day, essentially, where everything goes wrong. So basically everything that goes wrong in emergencies all happens on one day for this character named Mike. And his goal is basically just to get through the day. So it's not a noble goal, just a regular, please let me just do my job kind of a goal. But you know, obviously we're kind of playing at the emotion of humor in the fact that everything is going just terribly. Lightning strikes, computers are down, lights go out. You know, but it does get at a good question of, if all the lights go out in your health center, what do you do? What's the first thing you should do? And so it's using humor, but really kind of helps prod those questions of what do you do in these situations. So this was, you know, a fun project that incorporated storytelling in a very literal way, right? I mean, it even has a font that looks like a children's book font. So yeah, I mean, I think that can be an effective tool to incorporate storytelling. But and I started with this one so that we can kind of work our way backwards and look at a variety of ways to do that. And this being kind of a literal way. As fun as it is, let me contrast that with what you don't need to tell an effective story. And to help make that point, I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite high school teachers. And this is probably the most important story I'll tell in this hour. This is in Chisago Lakes, Minnesota, probably the year 2000, give or take. And I suppose this illustration would help to have some context. My older brother was your stereotypical left-brained, math and science are easy person. And let's just say I was more of a right-brained creative type. So for him, every math and science class was just kind of a walk in the park. Anyway, it's not that he was competitive or like prideful about it. It was just kind of boring, easy for him all the way through. And so when he was a senior in high school, he took this physics class. And, I remember looking at his textbook and, some of the worksheets or whatever he'd bring home and, the equations. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is no joke. And I was a couple years behind him. I'm going to get destroyed in a couple years when I take that class. Just listen to this. The acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the net force and is inversely proportional to the mass of an object. Okay, sure. And so when I became a senior, sure enough, I signed up for physics and I was feeling a little trepidation. But it ended up being one of my favorite and most memorable classes in high school. And the reason was the teacher. He's this high energy football coach named Jeff Sarasic. And he wasn't just a man of science or a man of sports. He was also a storyteller. And Mr. Sarasic, what he did was he used this character. And like when my main memory of that class is this stick figure named Maynard. And so Mr. Sarasic would use this same character throughout like every lesson, whether it was like a whiteboard or in the exam paper, behind every complex equation, every one of Newton's laws, there was Maynard. And, he'd put him in all these kind of different situations. He'd be falling out of an airplane. He'd be trying to push an object and, like whatever the situation. In this case, I think he's trying to throw a bottle onto the shore for some reason. And these are basic elements. Anyway, I survived physics. I don't think I got an A, but I did okay. And I enjoyed the class and much more than I thought I would. And so what's the lesson of this story? It's not about high art or even really an elaborate or clever plot. We need to, thinking in terms of stick figure level stories can be effective. So you don't need things you don't need to tell an effective story. You don't need a professional illustrator, and you don't need a super clever plot. And that kind of brings us to that number 2. That really, thinking about something as complicated as Newton's second law of motion. Stories can communicate the essence of an idea. So compare something like this that just feels like bits of disparate information. I don't have anything to grasp onto if I'm totally unfamiliar with these concepts. Help me, build a bridge so I can understand what these weird shapes and letters and words mean. At least that was me talking as a senior. Maybe some of you are a little bit more left brain inclined like my brother. But all of a sudden you start drawing Maynard and a cannon and you talk about the force moving this way. And then when the cannon shoots, it's going to recoil this way and a force moving in equal and opposite directions. All of a sudden you have a hook to grab onto, and then you can kind of move into the more complex comprehension. Stories can elicit emotion, but they can also communicate the essence of an idea. Help us wrap our head around a concept. Number 3. Stories can help an audience imagine a future state. Kendra Hall is a storytelling expert, and she describes stories falling into this sequence: normal, explosion, or disruption, new normal. Normal, explosion, new normal. And I think too often in e-learning, or sales presentations, we just jump right into that new normal. and we spend just our entire time, or almost our entire time, focused on like, here's what's coming. And in certain situations, I think it really helps to just make sure you describe the setting of the story. And you see this used in sales presentations or software demos, this kind of structure. And think about Steve Jobs in that famous presentation of the iPhone in 2007. And I don't, if you haven't seen it, or you haven't seen it in a while, it's worth going back and watching it with a storytelling lens. He starts out by putting in the setting of the story, the normal. So that's the, and he sets it up as a, with humor to say like, oh, look at all these buttons. It just doesn't feel right. This is, this is the current user experience, and it's a problem. And so in spending that time in the setting, then he moves on to the disruption. In this case, it's kind of it's a positive disruption to say, okay, this is going to change everything. Boom. Okay. And then of course he goes on to describe, this is the future state. Here's what the future is going to be and look like. And he describes that. But notice that by spending that time in the normal, the current state that was, when he gets to the future state explanation, it's just all the more dynamic and all the more exciting because of that setup. And in the training department, we need to be the storytellers of the future state. Now, I will say it's a lot easier to get a standing ovation when you're describing an iPhone rather than rolling out your new ERP. That's fine. That's given. But I think that's what makes it all the more important. We don't want to just communicate the what, but really the why, and sometimes the context of the setting, etc. Future state. If there's change on the horizon of your organization, especially big change, that every individual is asking that question: what will this mean for me? It's a search for meaning and kind of understanding that what might feel a little chaotic. So we need to be able to compare and contrast the before and after in story terms. Especially if you need buy-in. So stories can accomplish or can help audiences imagine a future state. And finally, stories can illustrate the consequences of a series of choices. Dan Taylor said, "At the heart of most stories is choice, the necessity of choosing with the uncertainty of consequences." At the heart of most stories is choice, the necessity of choosing coupled with the uncertainty of consequences. And this is really where learning experience design can shine, because we often work in an interactive medium, right? By that, I mean, we can have clickable, branchable realities. Let me show you a few examples. I think back to a project we did on common compliance issues or scenarios for a healthcare system. And it was broken into 4 scenarios. And this was a third-person narrative. So you, the user, are helping this character, Kim, navigate her day. And so, she witnesses some things, she has conversations, and you need to make choices to help her throughout her day. Kind of a choose your own adventure type of compliance course. And so, in each of these situations, what we did was we gave her choices in this story. But what we did was we didn't give a correct, incorrect immediately after a selection, right? She makes a choice, and we attempted to make those choices not entirely clear what the right answer is. that makes sense. Believable distractors, I guess you could call it, where somebody offers her, for instance, a gift, a small gift, like a little bracelet that this person's niece made, and it's just sort of a polite gesture of thanks that the patient is giving to the employee, and it seems polite to just accept, something that feels like a reasonable error in compliance. And so we give her the opportunity to say, thank you, I appreciate that. Or we say, that's so nice, but I'm afraid this is something I can't do. And it actually offends the patient a little bit. And so you know what I mean? Like by trying to get into situations that don't have a clear feeling of right and wrong, but there's a little bit of ambiguity about the situation. And I think that's, often how some of these real life situations play out. So anyway, there's no immediate response, but there are consequences to her series of choices. And the consequences take the form of, her talking to her boss later in the module. So each choice triggers a variable that will change what the boss says to Kim at the end of the day or later in the day. And so she may get scolded or reminded or, whatever the case may be. I guess if you hit all of the wrong answers, in all of the situations, I think there is a pathway where she gets fired or something close to it, something like that. So again, at the heart of most stories is choice. So how can we make those choices not just a multiple choice question, but something that really is true to life? So just briefly, here's another example where in this case, it's a first person narrative. And we're sitting across the table from a client. And in this case, the user is trying to, solicit information for, I believe, an audit. And so they, in their task, they need to ask the right questions to get the right information so they can go back to their office and fill out the form correctly. And so what we did was we gave the user 3 question options to ask. Or more than 3, just like 3 at a time, and have a series of questions. And at any time they can say, all right, I have everything I need, and leave. And so, it gives them a series of choices which mimics their kind of real day in the life experience. And again, trying to help the user suffer a little bit, stand adjacent to the suffering, without fully suffering, right? Where we're practicing in the learning design space, where you can practice getting something wrong and see what happens. So last example here, this is a sales module, sales training project. And this one really emphasized the characters themselves. And once again, little choices needing to be made along the way. This one, again, is a first-person setup where we made this fictitious client called the Lux Resort. And so you kind of feel like, oh man, I really want to win this client. This would be a really good one to have. And so you've got this guide that's giving you the lay of the land of the situation. And notice here how we try to add just simple context, the setting. Right here, the representative before you lost the laundry and housekeeping business for this, the cleaning products in the cleaning system. And so you kind of feel like, all right, I really, I want to win that back. And then we introduce characters and try to establish the scene. And again, production value wise, this is just a paragraph of text and a blurred out stock photo. This is very doable to just spend time trying to make it feel like there's stakes at play here. And then once you meet each individual character, one of the things that they had is a learn, what is the buying role of this individual? Is this a decision maker? Is this an approver? What is this? And, what are their motives here? And there's little clues along the way through email exchanges or, previous conversations that I think we even had like a fake LinkedIn profile for these individuals that really give this character some backstory. And so then with that, you can identify their motives and their, what might be levers to communicate with. So that, again, giving them choices like, here's how I'm going to respond, given what I know about the motives, etc. So let's recap. What can stories accomplish? They can elicit emotion, which can fuel the essence of an idea. They can help your audience imagine a future state, and they can illustrate the consequences of a series of choices. So as we end, here's the call. I just, encourage you all to begin embedding story into your training and into your communication. Try to adopt that lens as you look at your current materials, training materials, communication materials. Think about, what ways does this fit into a storytelling framework well? What ways maybe could we have done this differently that could have, elevated that connection by tapping into some of those instinctive storytelling dynamics? And I would encourage you not to think of stories as like just one more tool, or like one additional strategy tool in the toolbox. I think it's more. It's a little something deeper than that. It hits at more of, it's not just about conveying information in a new way. Stories don't just convey information; they convey meaning, and they draw lines of significance to our knowledge. And so by doing that, you'll make the lessons more inspiring and more memorable. Thank you very much. I appreciate you joining me on this conversation.